A billionaire bought a private island to escape betrayal, guilt, and loneliness. He thought money could buy him peace. But when a storm nearly took his life, strangers with nothing gave him everything he truly needed. What he found on that island wasn't power, it was forgiveness. And this is his story. Richard Coleman had always been a man who believed money could solve anything. After all, it had bought him power, influence, and respect in the world of technology. But now, after a bitter betrayal and the collapse of his marriage, he sought something money could not buy: peace. He purchased a remote island in the Caribbean, convinced it would become his fortress against pain. To him, solitude meant control. The island was breathtaking, with golden beaches stretching as far as the eye could see. Palm trees swayed lazily in the wind, and turquoise waters glistened under the sun. Richard admired the untouched beauty from his private villa, perched on a cliff. Everything about it screamed exclusivity, and that fed his pride. He wanted to believe he had finally outsmarted the chaos of life. His staff obeyed his orders without question. Imported wine filled his cellar, rare paintings decorated his walls, and every comfort money could buy surrounded him. Yet when the night came, silence pressed against his chest. Alone in his vast villa, Richard realized the walls echoed with emptiness. He had built a kingdom for one, but there was no joy in ruling it. At dinner, he thought about James, his former business partner. James had stolen not only his trust, but also millions from their company. The betrayal played in Richard's mind like a broken record. He clenched his fists, replaying conversations where he should have noticed the signs. Rage burned in him, but there was no one to hear his anger in the lonely dining hall. He remembered his ex-wife, Melissa, who left him after years of neglect. Money had provided her diamonds, cars, and vacations, but not his presence. The final fight between them still haunted him, her voice shaking, accusing him of valuing deals more than family. Now, in his isolation, her words felt like knives cutting deeper each night. Despite the pain, Richard convinced himself he was better off. "I don't need anyone," he muttered to himself as he poured another glass of whiskey. He told himself that peace was finally his. But his reflection in the glass revealed a man exhausted, haunted by mistakes and terrified of the silence. The island staff avoided speaking to him unless necessary. They were instructed to serve and disappear. Richard thought this arrangement was perfect, but secretly he longed for conversation. The absence of human warmth gnawed at him, though he refused to admit it. Pride demanded he maintain the facade of strength. At night, he walked along the beach, waves washing against his feet. He tried to let the sound calm him, but instead it reminded him of the restless ocean inside his chest. The stars above were brilliant, yet they only deepened his loneliness. He wondered if isolation had been a mistake, though he buried the thought quickly. Richard wrote in his leather-bound journal each night, listing his goals for the island. He planned expansions, luxurious upgrades, and maybe even a private dock for his yachts. It was his way of keeping control, of pretending everything was fine. But deep down, he knew he was running from more than just the outside world. And so, Richard Coleman began his life on the island, a man with everything money could buy, yet stripped of the things he needed most. He believed he had found a sanctuary, unaware that the island would soon force him to face the very truths he had spent years avoiding. If you believe every story has more beneath the surface, join us for the journey ahead. Subscribe now and don't miss what comes next in Richard's story. Days melted into one another on the island, each sunrise blurring into the next. Richard filled his mornings with business calls despite no longer running his company. He barked orders to assistants and lawyers, clinging to the illusion of control. Yet, when the calls ended, silence returned, and with it came memories he couldn't escape. The betrayal by James replayed endlessly. Richard had trusted him like a brother, only to watch him siphon millions and walk away unscathed. In his mind, Richard plotted revenge, imagining headlines where James finally faced justice. But these fantasies provided no comfort. They only deepened the bitterness that poisoned his soul. One night, Richard dreamed of his daughter, Emily. She was just a child in his memory, her laughter echoing in the halls of their old home. In the dream, she reached for his hand, but when he tried to hold hers, she vanished. He awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding with regret. He hadn't seen her in years, and the absence was unbearable. The villa's luxury became a gilded cage. He wandered the hallways lined with art, but none of it moved him. The chandeliers sparkled, but they couldn't illuminate his dark thoughts. Every detail reminded him of what he had lost, of how empty grandeur felt when no one shared it with him. He sat at his desk, flipping through old photographs. Melissa's smile stared back at him, bright and alive. Emily's small hands clutched his as they once posed for family portraits. Richard traced their faces with his fingers, overwhelmed by guilt. He whispered apologies into the air, knowing no one could hear. To drown the ache, he drank more each evening. Whiskey became his ritual, his escape. The burn in his throat was a distraction from the sharper burn in his heart. But the more he drank, the clearer his failures became. Alcohol blurred nothing. It only magnified the ghosts of his past. The island staff noticed his decline. They exchanged worried glances, but dared not speak. Richard saw their pity in their eyes and despised it. He dismissed half of them in anger, insisting he didn't need anyone. Alone once more, he believed isolation was strength, even as loneliness devoured him. At night, storms rumbled over the horizon. Richard stood on the balcony staring into the dark sea. Lightning illuminated the waves, wild and untamed, mirroring the chaos within him. He wondered if the ocean could swallow his regrets, if disappearing into it would finally bring him peace. One morning, unable to sleep, he ventured into the island's wilderness. The jungle was thick and buzzing with life, but Richard felt like an intruder. Birds scattered at his presence, as if the world itself rejected him. He realized then that he was not part of this place, not yet. Though Richard had bought the island with money, he hadn't yet earned his place on it. The land, the sea, and even his own heart resisted his presence. What he didn't know was that fate was preparing to humble him in ways money could never prevent. The morning began with calm seas, the horizon painted in soft blues and golds. Richard decided to take his yacht out, craving distraction from the shadows of his thoughts. He commanded the crew to remain behind, wanting complete control of the vessel. At first, the waters welcomed him, and the breeze seemed almost forgiving. But the sea had its own plans that day. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, turning the sky into a canvas of menace. Richard ignored the signs, convinced he could master even nature with his wealth and will. The waves rose higher, rocking the yacht with unsettling force. He gripped the wheel tightly, refusing to acknowledge fear. Arrogance blinded him to the danger swelling around him. Then the storm struck with full fury. Lightning split the sky, thunder roared, and waves slammed into the yacht. Richard fought desperately, shouting against the wind, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The boat tilted violently, throwing him against the deck. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Water surged over the rails, dragging him across the slippery surface. Richard clung to a rope, lungs burning, heart racing. Memories of Melissa and Emily flashed before his eyes like cruel visions. He realized with crushing clarity that if he died now, he would leave the world as nothing more than a bitter, lonely man. A monstrous wave towered above, crashing down with merciless strength. The yacht groaned, splintered, and surrendered to the sea. Richard was thrown into the churning depths, gasping for air as salt water filled his lungs. His empire, his power, his control, all of it meant nothing as the storm swallowed him whole. Richard's body drifted, tossed helplessly by the raging sea. Darkness closed in as his strength faded, but just before surrendering, he felt strong hands gripping him. Fishermen from the island pulled him into their modest boat, their voices urgent but steady. He coughed violently, the taste of salt stinging his throat, but he was alive. The fishermen rowed furiously toward the shore, muscles straining against the storm's fury. Among them was Isabella, a young woman with sharp eyes and a fierce spirit. She barked orders to the others, refusing to let Richard slip back into the sea. Her determination cut through the chaos like a beacon of survival. At last they reached the village's wooden dock, battered but standing. Richard was carried to a small hut, its roof leaking but its warmth undeniable. Miguel, the village elder, examined him with weathered hands and calm eyes. Though weak, Richard sensed no judgment from them, only a quiet compassion he hadn't known in years. He awoke later on a simple cot, covered with a rough blanket. The scent of herbs filled the air as Isabella placed a bowl of steaming broth beside him. "Eat," she commanded firmly, not out of courtesy but necessity. Richard, used to servants bowing at his will, felt strangely disarmed by her bluntness. For the first time since arriving on the island, Richard was not in control. He was vulnerable, dependent on strangers who lived with far less than he ever had. The irony struck him deeply. Despite all his wealth, it was the humility of fishermen that had saved his life. Richard's recovery was slow, but each day he regained strength. Yet, what unsettled him most was not the storm's memory, but the way the villagers lived. Their huts were simple, their meals modest, and their laughter frequent. He observed children running barefoot, chasing each other with joy untainted by wealth. For Richard it was incomprehensible. Determined to reassert his superiority, Richard tried offering money to those who helped him. He pulled out a wad of bills, waving it like a lifeline he believed everyone would grab. But instead of gratitude, he was met with silence and suspicious glances. The villagers exchanged looks that pierced through his arrogance. Isabella, unafraid, confronted him directly. "We don't need your money," she said coldly, her voice carrying the weight of truth. Richard bristled, unused to rejection. He tried to argue, claiming wealth was the only path to comfort, but her eyes dismissed him with sharp disdain. For once, his riches held no power. The more he pushed, the more resistance he faced. Fishermen refused his offers, children ignored his gifts, and Miguel quietly observed, saying little. Richard's ego, so accustomed to dominance, began to feel cornered. For the first time, he wondered if money might not be the universal key he believed it was. That night, lying on the cot in the humble hut, Richard replayed the day's humiliation. His pride screamed at him to leave, but his body was still too weak. Deep down, however, another voice whispered, maybe this rejection was exactly what he needed to hear, yet he wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. With no strength to return to his villa, Richard remained in the village. Days stretched into weeks, and he was forced into routines far removed from luxury. He fetched water from the well, carried firewood, and helped repair nets under Isabella's watchful eye. At first, every task felt beneath him. Slowly, though, necessity wore away his resistance. The villagers didn't treat him like a billionaire. They treated him like any man. When he complained, they ignored his words. When he faltered, they encouraged him without pity. Richard hated it, yet a strange sense of belonging crept in. Each completed task gave him a flicker of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. Isabella remained his harshest critic. She corrected his mistakes bluntly, reminding him of his weaknesses. Yet, beneath her sternness, Richard caught glimpses of kindness, a bowl of extra food, a brief smile when he finally succeeded. Her contradictions frustrated him, but also drew him in, stirring emotions he couldn't explain. Miguel, on the other hand, spoke with patience. He shared quiet lessons about the sea, the land, and life's balance. His wisdom unsettled Richard, who was used to charts, numbers, and control. Miguel often told him, "The sea forgives no arrogance." Though Richard scoffed, the words stayed with him, echoing like waves against his mind. At night, Richard gazed at the stars above the village. Unlike the empty silence of his villa, here he heard laughter, singing, and life. He still felt out of place, but no longer completely unwelcome. For the first time, Richard began to wonder if the island he had bought was not truly his, but meant to change him instead. Richard's relationship with Isabella was strained from the start. She saw through his arrogance and wasn't afraid to challenge him. Whenever he failed at simple tasks, she mocked him lightly, making him grind his teeth. Yet, despite her sharp words, Richard respected her honesty. She was the first person in years to treat him without fear or flattery. One morning, Richard accompanied her to the sea to check the nets. The sun cast golden light across the waves, and for a moment, he felt oddly at peace. Isabella handed him a net, expecting him to help. His clumsy efforts made her laugh, a sound he hadn't heard directed at him in years. It pierced his pride, but softened his heart. As the days passed, Richard began to notice things about Isabella he hadn't before. The way she carried herself with strength, the fierce protectiveness she showed her people, and the vulnerability in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. She wasn't just a fisherwoman, she was a leader. Their conversations shifted from arguments to reluctant confessions. Richard shared pieces of his past, admitting his failures with Melissa and Emily. To his surprise, Isabella listened without judgment, though her silence was sharp with unspoken thoughts. Her presence forced him to confront truths he had long buried beneath wealth and pride. By nightfall, Richard found himself seeking her company, despite their clashes. For reasons he didn't yet understand, her words lingered longer than his memories of luxury. Something was changing in him, something he couldn't control, no matter how much he wanted to deny it. Miguel became Richard's quiet mentor, guiding him with patience rather than force. The elder spoke of tides, winds, and the rhythm of life as though they were connected to the soul. "The sea gives and takes," he often said, his voice calm but firm. Richard, though skeptical, listened more than he admitted. One evening, Miguel invited Richard to mend nets with him. At first, Richard struggled with the delicate knots, cursing under his breath. Miguel only chuckled, telling him, "You can't rush patience." The lesson irritated Richard, yet by the night's end he found himself repeating those words in his mind. Over time, Richard realized Miguel wasn't just teaching him about fishing, he was teaching him about humility, about surrendering control. "Pride is heavier than any anchor," Miguel told him one night. The words struck deeper than Richard expected, forcing him to question how much his pride had cost him in life. Despite resisting, Richard found himself respecting Miguel. The old man's wisdom carried no judgment, only quiet truth. Unlike James, who had betrayed him, Miguel sought nothing in return. Richard couldn't remember the last time someone had given without expectation. It unsettled him, but it also stirred something hopeful. Under Miguel's guidance, Richard began to feel less like an outsider. The villagers still watched him cautiously, but he was no longer the arrogant stranger who waved money in their faces. Slowly, he was becoming a man who listened, learned, and worked alongside them. And though he didn't yet admit it, he was changing. Richard began to settle into village life, though uneasily. He rose at dawn with the fishermen, pulling nets heavy with fish, his muscles aching from the unfamiliar labor. Sweat stung his eyes, but a quiet satisfaction lingered when the work was done. It wasn't wealth that gave him pride. It was effort. The villagers started to soften, though slowly. They greeted him with nods instead of silence, offered him bowls of stew without hesitation. Richard, unused to kindness without strings, felt unsettled. He didn't know whether to accept it or fear it. For a man used to contracts, trust without conditions was foreign. At night, the community gathered around fires, telling stories and singing songs. Richard sat apart at first, but the sound drew him in. Children laughed at his awkward clapping, and Isabella smirked knowingly. Against his will, Richard smiled, realizing he had laughed more in weeks than in years. It frightened him almost as much as it comforted him, but peace was fragile. Though he was learning, Richard still bristled at moments of humility. A broken tool, a failed catch, or a villager's remark could ignite his temper. Pride lingered like a shadow, reminding him of who he had been. Each time, Isabella's sharp tongue cut him down, pulling him back to reality. Despite the tension, Richard sensed something new stirring within himself. For the first time, he wasn't running from silence or drowning it in whiskey. The island was reshaping him, though he fought it with every breath. Deep inside, he wondered if the peace he felt was real, or just another illusion waiting to shatter. One evening, Isabella returned from the sea with an expression Richard couldn't read. She avoided him, her eyes burning with something sharper than anger. Finally, she confronted him, her words like a blade. "Do you remember a man named Javier Morales?" The name hit him like a stone thrown from the past. Richard searched his memory, then froze. Javier had been an employee he dismissed years ago without cause, a casualty of corporate downsizing. To Richard, it had been business. To Javier, it had been destruction. Isabella's voice trembled as she revealed the truth. Javier was her father. The decision Richard made had condemned her family to poverty. The world seemed to collapse around Richard. The guilt he had buried resurfaced with crushing force. His excuses, business, necessity, survival, crumbled in the face of her pain. He tried to speak, but no words could bridge the wound he had created. For the first time, he understood the depth of the damage his pride had caused. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "You ruined us, and now you live among us pretending you've changed." She turned away, leaving him broken in the firelight. The villagers, silent witnesses, looked at him with disappointment. Richard had lost what little trust he had gained. That night, Richard sat alone, staring at the sea. The stars above mocked him with their brilliance. He realized that no amount of work, no forced humility could erase the truth of his past. For the first time, he wondered if forgiveness was even possible, or if he was destined to remain a prisoner of his own sins. The revelation spread quickly through the village, whispered from hut to hut. Richard felt the weight of every stare, heavier than any storm he had faced. No one spoke to him directly, but the silence cut deeper than words. He tried to help with the nets the next morning, but hands pulled them away. His presence was no longer welcome. Isabella avoided him completely. Her absence was louder than her anger, leaving Richard hollow. He replayed every decision of his past, realizing how casually he had ruined lives for profit. To him, they had been numbers on a page, but here, those numbers had faces, families, and pain. The shame was unbearable. Miguel visited Richard that evening, carrying neither comfort nor blame. "The sea does not hold grudges, but people do," he said softly. "You cannot demand forgiveness. You must earn it, and even then it may never come." Richard listened, trembling. For the first time, he understood forgiveness wasn't his right. It was a gift. Richard tried to apologize to Isabella, but she refused to hear him. Her words were sharp. "You can't erase the years we suffered." He wanted to beg, to plead, but pride still chained his tongue. Instead, he retreated to his hut, where the silence suffocated him. Whiskey no longer dulled the ache, it only sharpened it. In the quiet, Richard realized he was standing at a crossroads. He could abandon the village and return to isolation, or he could stay, broken and unwanted, in hopes of proving himself. For the first time in his life, running felt like the coward's choice. Still, he wondered if staying would matter when the damage seemed beyond repair. The sea gave no time for reflection. Dark clouds gathered again, faster and fiercer than before. Villagers rushed to secure their boats and nets, fear written on their faces. Richard, though shunned, recognized the urgency. He had seen storms like this, and he knew it could destroy everything. This time he could not stand aside. Winds howled and rain lashed against the huts. Waves surged higher, threatening to tear the wooden docks apart. Children cried and families clung to one another. Richard saw Isabella guiding villagers toward safety, her determination as fierce as the storm itself. Despite her anger toward him, her courage left him breathless. Without waiting, Richard threw himself into action. He tied ropes, reinforced boats, and shouted warnings to those too close to the water. At first, no one listened, but when a section of dock broke away, his orders gained weight. The villagers followed, not out of trust, but out of necessity. As the storm raged, a group of children was trapped near a collapsing hut. Richard didn't hesitate. He ran through the flood, fighting against waves that clawed at his legs. The fear of drowning returned, but he pushed forward, driven not by pride, but by a desperate need to protect. He reached them just as the roof gave way. Dragging the children to safety, Richard collapsed in exhaustion, chest heaving. Around him the storm still roared, but something within him shifted. For once, he had acted not for profit, not for pride, but for others. He realized that survival was no longer enough. Redemption was what he truly sought. The storm's fury reached its peak as shouts echoed across the village. Isabella was trapped on the pier, trying to free a tangled boat before it sank. Richard saw her silhouette against the raging sea and his heart clenched. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward her, rain blinding his eyes, fear pounding in his chest. Waves slammed against the pier, threatening to break it apart. Richard fought the current, grabbing a rope to anchor himself. "Isabella!" he shouted, his voice torn by the wind. She turned, shock flashing in her eyes. Before she could protest, Richard reached her side, his hands raw as he worked the knots loose. The sea roared like a beast, and one massive wave struck, nearly throwing them both into the depths. Richard shielded Isabella with his body, taking the brunt of the impact. Pain tore through him, but he refused to let go. For once, he wasn't thinking about survival, only about saving her. Together, they freed the boat, but the pier cracked beneath their feet. Richard pushed Isabella towards safety, urging her to run. Another wave surged, pulling him under, salt water burning his lungs. In those moments of darkness, his thoughts weren't of wealth or betrayal, but of Emily's smile and the family he had lost. Hands pulled him back, rough but strong. The villagers had thrown ropes, dragging him from the jaws of the sea. Richard collapsed on the shore, barely conscious, his body trembling with exhaustion. Yet as he looked around and saw the children safe, the boats secured, and Isabella alive, a fragile peace filled his heart. When dawn broke, the storm was gone, leaving the village battered but standing. Richard awoke weak, his body aching but alive. Around him, villagers worked tirelessly to repair their homes. For the first time, they didn't look at him with suspicion, but with quiet respect. His sacrifice had spoken louder than his past. Isabella approached slowly, her eyes unreadable. Richard struggled to sit, bracing himself for rejection, but instead of anger, she offered him water. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "You risked your life for us. For me." The weight of her words broke the last of his defenses. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered, "I'm sorry." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of pain. Finally, Isabella nodded. "You can't erase what happened, but you've shown you're not the same man anymore." Her forgiveness wasn't complete, but it was real. Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope. It warmed him more than any luxury ever had. The villagers gathered, offering food, bandages, and words of gratitude. For the first time, Richard wasn't an outsider, but a part of something greater than himself. He realized forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to move forward, and in that moment he felt lighter, as if the sea itself had released him. That night, as fires burned across the shore, Richard joined the songs and laughter. He wasn't a billionaire, nor a man defined by power. He was simply Richard, flawed and redeemed. Looking at Isabella across the flames, he knew that forgiveness wasn't just her gift to him. It was his gift to himself. The days after the storm were filled with rebuilding, but also with renewal. Richard worked alongside the villagers, his hands blistered yet steady. He funded repairs and introduced sustainable tools, not as a show of power, but as a gesture of gratitude. For the first time, his wealth wasn't a wall, it was a bridge. Isabella, though still guarded, treated him with a quiet acceptance. She saw his effort not as charity, but as sincerity. Miguel, ever wise, told Richard, "The island has tested you and you have listened." Those words echoed in Richard's heart. He wasn't proud, but he was at peace. Humility had finally replaced his arrogance. One evening, Richard sat by the shore, journal in hand. His notes no longer listed profits or expansions, but dreams of education for the children, safer boats for the fishermen, and cleaner water for the village. For once, his legacy wasn't measured in dollars, but in lives touched. The thought brought him unexpected joy. That night, Miguel handed him an envelope delivered by a passing boat. Richard opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from Emily, his estranged daughter. Her words were cautious but hopeful. "I'd like to see you again, Dad." Tears filled his eyes as he realized the island had not only given him forgiveness, but also a second chance at family. Richard looked at the stars above the calm sea, the same sea that had once tried to take his life. Now it felt like a companion, no longer an enemy. He whispered into the night, "Thank you." The island had stripped him of pride, wealth, and control, only to return something greater. Forgiveness had given him a new legacy. Richard's story reminds us of a powerful truth. Money can buy comfort, but it will never buy forgiveness, family, or peace. In the end, the greatest riches are found in love, humility, and second chances. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think is more valuable than money? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more emotional stories that inspire the heart. Until next time, stay inspired. Stories like Richard's remind us that wealth isn't measured in money, but in forgiveness and second chances. If this touched your heart, subscribe for more inspiring stories and tell us in the comments, what does forgiveness mean to you?